Now, to continue our discussion of Aristotle, he thought that there were different parts of the human soul, and he was inspired to believe this from his teacher Plato, who believed that the soul was tripartite, meaning there were three parts to the soul. So Aristotle divides the human soul up in the following ways. One, there's the vegetative part, and we share this with plants and animals. It's all that stuff that is happening on autopilot. So for plants, for instance, photosynthesis is vegetative. For animals and humans, things like our blood circulation system would be vegetative, or metabolism is vegetative. It's all those things that we don't control, and they just happen and they keep us alive. He also thought that humans had an appetitive part of the soul, and this is something that we do not share with plants. Plants do not have this, but animals do. So we share this with animals. And regarding the appetitive part of the soul, it's the desires. It's the way that we desire things, and we strive to achieve those desires or attain what we desire. So we're not passive beings like plants, but humans and animals have desires, and we try to fulfill those desires. Okay, so we're talking about an internal appetite, like the motivations, the internal sources of energy and enthusiasm with which we approach life. That's what we're referring to here when we talk about the appetitive part of the soul. And of course, satisfying our desires might lead to a good life, and it might lead to a bad life. For instance, drug addicted people desire drugs, but fulfilling that desire actually makes their life worse. So the goal isn't to just satisfy all the desires that you find yourself having, but to satisfy the right kinds of desires. And that brings us to the next part of the soul, reason. This Aristotle thought, and he might be wrong about this, but he thought that humans were uniquely rational beings. We see evidence today that animals have reasoning capabilities as well, but Aristotle thought that humans were uniquely rational creatures. And his teacher Plato believed this as well. And Plato, like Aristotle, thought that reason should be in control. The good life has to be one where reason is controlling the agent. But Aristotle divided reason up in a different way than his teacher Plato. So let's look at how Aristotle considers reason. There are two parts of the rational part of the human soul. One is deliberative or calculative. It thinks about what we do. It plans. It plans our actions. It's strategic. It approaches our needs in a specific way. It reviews the effectiveness of what we've done. So we're not talking about instinct here. We are talking about planning, where animals, according to Aristotle, have just instinct. Humans deliberate. Okay, and we can plan to get things external fulfillments or internal fulfillments. So when we talk about external, we're talking about getting something that is outside of us, and we enjoy it when we get it. Okay, so you all have made a plan for your future degree by coming to school. So that would be an external fulfillment. The degree comes to you from outside, from the institution, and you do all the work and you achieve it. You have achieved an external fulfillment. But humans also, in their deliberation, are internally fulfilled. There's a satisfaction that comes with doing a good job. Consider, you could just get the degree, but kind of just skate by and get, the bare minimum done in all your classes so that you earn that external degree. But you can also really dedicate yourself to your studies and do the best that you can and study for the enjoyment of it. And you will not only get that degree at the end of your experience, you will also be internally fulfilled through your experience. So when you feel proud of what you're doing, that's involved in deliberation, and it is the internal enjoyment of deliberating well. Okay, so in either case, it's important that you have strong, rational deliberation skills. You need to know how to achieve what you want to achieve, and there's this great sense of joy, pleasure, eudaimonia when you deliberate well. You know, when you've really thought through a plan and then you put it into action. There's a great feeling that comes with that kind of deliberation that doesn't come with just acting spontaneously. And then also involved in reason is contemplation. So where deliberation has you think about things that you can change, like right now you don't have a degree and you're working to get a degree, that's a change. Contemplation, or the contemplative part of the soul, thinks rationally about things you cannot change. Okay, so theoretical ideas in like theoretical physics, mathematics, philosophy, theology, these are things that you cannot change. We're doing this in this ethics class. As much as we think about the nature of right and wrong, we don't personally influence the nature of right and wrong. Right and wrong has, it's kind of an unchanging aspect of the universe. Even if you're a relativist and you think that right and wrong depends on what, your personal beliefs, it's still the nature of ethics, the nature of morality to be relative. And that's something that you don't change. You're either right about it or you're wrong about it. And the same goes with mathematics, for instance. You're either right about a mathematical proof, you've either proven something or you haven't, but you don't change anything. So this is also an important part of the good and happy life. It's not just that we're always trying to get things, and achieve things. We're also, as human beings, just interested in the nature of things themselves. And that is where contemplation comes in. In either case, Aristotle thought that the virtuous person who had intellectual virtue did a good job of deliberating and contemplating because they had strong rational skills. They could think logically. They thought with consistency. They weren't constantly committing logical errors, like committing fallacies. They weren't misled by bad information. They knew how to weigh information and set their beliefs according to the value of the information they have, etc. Okay, now for Aristotle, there are different kinds of virtues. There are moral virtues, which have to do with your character, and there are intellectual virtues, and they're dealt with differently in the Nicomachean Ethics. But the key intellectual virtue is prudence, which is practical wisdom. It's just knowing intuitively what the right amount is. How much to do, when to do it, who to do it with, when to stop doing it. It's to be able to grasp that, and that involves a kind of an intellectual wisdom, like a grasping of what is the case. So that's an important virtue, and arguably the most important virtue. But we're going to look here at moral virtues, which are also extremely important. And moral virtues have to do with your character. So let's talk about the golden mean real quick. Aristotle found that virtuous character traits, always rested in between excess and deficiency. So for any virtue, there would be a corresponding vice that would have an excess, of what went into that virtue. And there would be a corresponding vice on the other end that had a deficiency of it. Courage is, I think, one of the most simple moral virtues to consider in this respect. Courage mean it has to do with of acting appropriately in a dangerous situation. Okay. Now, suppose that you walk upon a burning building. Okay. Now, if you're courageous, you will run into that building and save people if you had a reasonable expectation that you would be successful. Okay. Uh, you wouldn't, if you were to just run into the building without first assessing the situation, like considering whether it's going to fall down, and whether it's about to fall down, whether there are people inside or not, whether there's any real way of being effective, of actually helping. If you were just to run into that building, you were arguably not courageous. You had an excessive amount of courage, and that actually turned into a vice called recklessness. You were acting recklessly. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum, if you were just paralyzed by fear, and despite having a reasonable chance of doing some good by running in and saving people, you just were paralyzed outside, unable to do anything, then you had a deficiency of courage. And that would be, of course, cowardice. So courage rests in between these two extremes. And Aristotle thought this was the case of all moral virtues. Let's take the example of good temper, another virtue in a person. A good-tempered person can be described by Aristotle as one who is angry at the right things and with the right people, and further, as he ought, when he ought, and as long as he ought. Okay. So, of course, there's an excessive amount of good temper, okay, and that would be, sometimes these vices don't even have good names to put with them, but think of a pushover. Okay, someone who doesn't get angry at all about anything, and when someone seriously causes them harm or slights them or acts disrespectfully towards them, they just aren't mad. They aren't fazed at all. We might say that is an excessive amount of good temper to the person's detriment. Okay, they'll start to be taken advantage of, for instance, and that wouldn't lead them to a good life. And then, of course, there's the deficiency of good temper, someone who is overly angry, or is angry at the wrong people, or is angry for more time than the situation warrants. Then that would be a deficiency of good temper, and it would be an irascibility, just an ease with which one becomes angered, and that also does not lead to a good life, and it doesn't make a person admirable in society. Liberality has to do with giving the right amount. So the liberal person, we're not talking about politics here, but we're talking about the person who gives the right amount to the right people at the right time for the right amount of time. So of course the overly liberal person would be giving too much, to the wrong people, for too long of a time. We might think of that kind of person as enabling somebody. Okay, and that's not a virtue in a person. A virtuous person does not enable people. They give appropriately. And so the liberal person gives appropriately. And on the other end, if you have a deficiency of liberality, then you don't give anything. And then you're like Ebenezer Scrooge, okay? And of course, Ebenezer Scrooge is a villain until he changes his character. So again, that wouldn't be admirable to not give anything, even when it's appropriate and there's people who could really benefit. So again, this all ties into that practical wisdom of knowing when the right time is to give and how much the right amount is to give. So all these moral virtues are tied in together with that intellectual virtue of practical wisdom.